Begin this morning with a question. I want to ask you this. How do you eat an elephant? You guys know this, right? How do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time, right? And you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with the sermon this morning? And I'll tell you in just a few moments, but you got to wait, be patient a little bit. So we're going to look at that this morning. This morning we come to the end of this series that we've been going through called Little Books with a Big Message, and we've been going through some of the smaller books in the Old Testament and the New Testament, and today we're going to look at Titus chapter 3, which will be the last one in this message. And in Titus chapter 3, Paul is dealing with an issue there that's one that we really struggle with as well. And what we're going to find is that what Paul wrote almost 2,000 years ago is really relevant for us today, because we're struggling with some of the same things that those Christians in Crete were struggling with. Hopefully you remember a couple of weeks ago as we began the book of Titus, we talked about what it was like to live in Crete. And it was a tough place for Christians to live. I mean, think about it. They're part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman government was really hostile to Christians. They didn't like Christians at all. They were actively persecuting Christians. And then on Crete itself, Crete was a real pagan culture, a pagan society with all these pagan gods and goddesses. And so for those Christians there, it was a really tough place for them to live. And so the question that would come up when you live in a place like that is, how am I supposed to live as a follower of Jesus Christ, as a disciple of Jesus Christ, in a culture that's so hostile to Christians? And isn't that really the same thing that we struggle with today as followers of Jesus Christ? Here in the United States in the year 2018, it's a tough thing. It can be a really hard thing for us to live as followers of Jesus Christ sometimes. And so this morning we're going to look at that and look what Paul has to say about what it's like to live in a situation like that. And as we do that, we're going to deal with some of the same questions that they did. I mean, think about how were they supposed to live as Christians? Were they supposed to try to overthrow the government? Were they to go out and protest? Were they to go out and point out sins in other people's lives and try to get them to change their behavior? How are they supposed to do? How do you eat an elephant? And the answer is we're going to see this morning is, and you're probably wondering, what does that have to do with the sermon this morning? That we really only have one. I'll tell you in just a few moments. As followers of Jesus Christ, and our mission is to take, so we're going to look at that and make sure that the gospel is something we come to the end of this series that we've been going through. And that was the thing for them. Really, the gospel is the only thing that matters. We've been going through some of the smaller books in the Old Testament. I mean, think about it. Let's say you have today we're going to look at one of them that believes homosexuality is a sin, and the other thinks it's chapter 3. The fact Paul is dealing with this issue there that's one that Jesus Christ they're both equally going to hell, aren't they? And what we're going to find is that think about a pastor and a prostitute. You know what? There's no difference in God's eyes between them if those Christians, unless they both put their faith in Jesus Christ. Hopefully you remember a couple of weeks ago as we began the book of Titus, we talked about it doesn't matter whether you voted for Hillary Clinton. And it was a tough place for Christians to live. I mean, think about it. They're part of the Roman Empire, and the Roman government, everyone who voted without Jesus Christ, without faith in Christians at all, they were actively persecuting Christians. And then on Crete, and so what we're going to see this morning pagan culture, a pagan society, as followers of Jesus Christ, is to make sure that we take there. It was a really world around us, because for that's the one thing that really matters. And so the question that would come up when you live in a place like that is, how am I supposed to live? There was an author named John Seal, and he had a really interesting quote. I read it this week. He said this: "A politicized faith not only blurs the same thing that we struggle with today as followers of Jesus Christ." Here in the United States, I think when we get off on the right and we try to politicize our faith, what it does is it does blur our priorities. It takes us away from the main thing, which is to take the gospel. We're going to look at that and share it with the world about what it's like to live in a situation. And it certainly can weaken our loyalties. When our loyalties are to be to Jesus Christ alone, deal with some of the same questions. And I've been there myself. Think about how were they supposed to live as Christians? Were they supposed to try to overthrow the government? Between Jesus Were they to go out and protest? Were they to go out and point out sins in other people's lives and try to get them to change their behavior? What were they How are they supposed
And here's the main idea that I want us to take away.
And the answers we're going to see this morning is
Christians are to
is
live
for
in
them
a way
and for us is that
people
we
are
really
attracted
only
to
have
the
one
gospel
mission.
and not repelled by it.
As followers of Jesus Christ, and our mission
We're
is
to live in a
take
way that people are
and make sure
attracted
that
to
the
the
gospel is
gospel
something that and not repelled by its followers. And that's really
that was the thing for them.
Really, the gospel is the only thing that matters, isn't it?
I mean, think about
Once
it. Let's
again,
say you have
there's
two
so
people.
much
One
just
of them
in
that
one
believes
chapter here that
homosexuality
we
is
could
a
spend
sin, and
weeks
the
on.
other
Matter of
thinks it's
fact,
okay.
I'm only going to look at
The
first
fact
8
is,
verses
without
this
Jesus
morning.
Christ, without faith,
And
and we're
Jesus
going to
Christ,
find
they're
out that
both
even in
equally
one little
going to
section
hell,
of
aren't
3 or
they?
4 verses, we could spend 6
Think
or 7
about
weeks.
a pastor
So,
and a prostitute.
we really
You know
only
what?
have time to
There's
touch
no
the surface
difference
this
in
morning.
God's
I
eyes
think
between
we
them
can pull this idea out. So
unless
if you have
they
your
both
Bibles,
put
go
their
ahead and
faith
open
in
up to the
Jesus
book of
Christ,
Titus.
they're gonna go to
Hopefully you're
hell
still
as
there
well.
from last
It
week.
really doesn't matter.
And I am. I'm going to read just the
It
first
doesn't
8
matter
verses of
whether
chapter
you
3.
voted for Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump or no one at all or someone else in the last
Remind them to
election.
be submissive to rulers
Everyone
and
who
authorities,
voted
to be
without
obedient,
Jesus Christ, without
to be
faith
ready
in
for
Jesus
every
Christ,
good
they're
work,
all equally
to
going
speak evil of no one, to avoid quarreling, to
And
be
so
gentle,
what
and
we're
to
going
show
to see
perfect
this
courtesy
morning is
toward all
that
people.
our
For
mission
we ourselves
as
were
followers
once
of
foolish,
Jesus Christ is to make
disobedient,
sure that we
led
take the
astray,
gospel
slaves
to
to
the world
various
around us,
passions
because
and pleasures,
that's the one
passing
thing
our
that
days
really
in
matters,
malice
and
and
that's the
envy,
message
hated
that
by
we're gonna
others
see
and
this
hating one
morning.
another. But when the goodness
There was an
and
author
loving
named John
kindness of
Seal,
God, our
and
Savior, appeared.
he had a really
He saved
interesting
us,
quote. I
not
read it this week. He
because of
said this:
works
"A
done by us in
politicized faith
righteousness,
not
but
only
according to
blurs
his own
our
mercy,
priorities, but
by the
weakens our
washing of
loyalties."
regeneration and renewal
And I
of the
think
Holy
he's
Spirit,
right. I think
whom
when
he
we
poured out on us
get off
richly
on the
through
right and we
Jesus
try to
Christ,
politicize our faith, what it
so that
does
being
is it
justified
does
by
blur
His
our
grace, we
priorities.
might become
It takes
heirs
us away
according
from
to
the
the
main
hope of
thing, which is
eternal
to
life.
take the gospel.
The saying
and
is
to share it with
trustworthy,
the
and I
world around
want
us that is
you
dying
to
and going to
insist
hell.
on these things, so that
And it
those
certainly
who have
we can
believed in
weaken
God
our
may
loyalties
be
when our
careful
loyalties
to devote
are to be
themselves
to
good
Jesus
works.
Christ alone. It's
These
really
things
easy
are
sometimes,
excellent
and I've been there myself.
profitable
I'm not,
for
you know,
people.
I'm not saying that this is just your problem. I've been there
As
myself.
we've been going through
where my
Titus here,
loyalties
hopefully
got
you remember
split
that in
between
Titus
Jesus
chapter
Christ
1,
and
Paul
between some politics.
writes to Titus about the importance of
And so that's what Paul's going to
godly
deal with,
church
this whole
leaders in
idea
the
this
church,
morning,
because they were
in
there
Titus
to help
chapter
protect
3.
the people.
And
from
here's
false
the
teaching.
main idea.
And then he
that I
goes
want us
on
to
in
take
chapters
away
2
from
and
this.
3, and he says that
Not only do
Christians
you
are
need to
to
be
live in a
protected
way
against false
that
teachers,
people
but you
are
need to
attracted
live
to
your
the
life
gospel
in a way
and not
so that
repelled
you
by
can
its
be a
followers.
witness to the world around you. And last week
We're to live in a way
chapter
that
2,
people are
we
attracted to the
primarily
gospel
talked about relationships
and not
within
repelled
the
by
body
its
of followers.
followers.
And that's really the
How are we
the
to live
message
together
that
within the
comes
body of Christ
out
in a
of
way
Titus
that makes the
chapter 3
gospel
this morning.
attractive to other people?
Once again,
And
we
now
have
when he
so
gets to
much
chapter
just
3,
in-
he's going to
in
be
one
more
chapter
outwardly
here that
focused.
we
He's
could
going to
spend
deal
weeks
here
on.
with,
As a matter of
with
fact,
the
I'm
good
only gonna
deeds
look
that
at the
we're to
first
do
8
in
verses
order
this
for us
morning.
to be a good witness.
And we're going
to
to
those
find
who are
out that
outside
even
the
in
church.
one little
Things the
section
way
of
that
3 or 4
treat
verses,
them,
we could spend
rather
6
than
or
just
7
the way
weeks.
that we treat
So
each other. And so
we
that's,
really only have
that's
time
what he's
to
going
touch
to deal
the
with
surface
here.
this morning. But I
And he
think
begins
we
the
can pull this
chapter with the
idea out. So
command
if
to
you have your Bibles,
remember.
go ahead and open up to the book
And
of
he's going
Titus.
to remind
Hopefully you're still there
Titus
from
in the
last
church
week.
and us
And
of
I am.
4
I'm going to read just
important
the
things
first
that we
8
need to,
verses
that
of
we need
chapter
to
3
remember,
this
things
morning.
that we need to think about. And I'm going to kind of deal
Here's
with
what
these
Paul writes to Titus.
in backwards
Remind them
order
to be
because,
submissive to
like
rulers
last
and
week, I
authorities,
want to
to
begin
be
with the
obedient,
why,
to be
and
ready
then we'll
for every
finish
good
with the
work.
what.
Because
Speak
once
evil
again, I
of
think
no
we
one,
need to
to avoid
understand the
quarreling,
why,
be
before
gentle,
the
and
what.
to
And
show
so,
perfect
so he
courtesy toward
begins
all
in
people.
verse 8, and he kind of
For
gives
we
us the
ourselves
why.
were
And he
once
says the
foolish,
first thing we need to do is we need to
led
remember the
astray,
mission.
slaves to various passions.
We
and
need to
pleasures,
remember the mission
passing
that
our
God has
days
given
in
to us.
malice
And here's
and
what he
envy,
writes at the
hated
end of
by others and
chapter,
hating
or
one
verse
another.
8. He
But
says
when the
these
goodness
things, he's speaking
and
of
loving
everything he's
kindness
talked
of God,
about
our
in
Savior,
verses 1
appeared.
through 7.
He
The first
saved
part of verse
us,
8, he
not
says all these
because of
things
works done
that
by
they're
us in
excellent and they're
righteousness,
profitable,
but according to
he
his
says
own
for
mercy.
the people.
By the washing of
So my question
regeneration
is,
and
who are
renewal
the
of the
people
Holy
that he's
Spirit,
talking about? Who
whom
are
he
the people
poured out
that
on us
are all
richly
these
through
things,
Jesus
and we'll get
Christ,
to
our
them in
Savior.
just a moment, are
So that
profitable
being
for us.
justified
abide by his grace, we might become heirs according to
pretty
the hope of
ambiguous,
eternal
and I
life.
think he did it on
The
purpose.
saying is trustworthy, and I
Only
want
Paul did that
you
by
to
accident.
insist on
He did.
these
He
things so that
writes this in a
those who
way
have believed
so
in
that it
God
can
may
apply
be
both to
careful
those who are
devote
doing the good
themselves to
works,
good works.
and it's profitable for
These
them
things are
because they get the
excellent
blessings of being
and
obedient to
profitable
God and carrying out his
people.
mission. And we've talked about that before. that there's great
As we've been
blessing
going
in
through
being
Titus
obedient
here,
to God
hopefully you
and doing
remember
what
that
He's
in
called us
Titus
to do.
chapter 1,
So
Paul
it's profitable
writes
for
to
them,
Titus about
and
the
it's excellent
importance
for
of
them,
but it's
appointing
also excellently church
profitable
leaders
for
in the
those who are
church because
outside
they
the
were
church.
there to help protect the
Because
people
when we do
from
the
false
kind of good
teaching.
works that he's going to talk
And
about
then he
here
goes
in
on
these
in
verses,
chapters
which
2
we'll
and
get to
3
in a
and he
moment,
says,
it
not
becomes
only
a
do you
great
need to be
witness, it
protected
makes the
against
gospel
false teachers, but you need to
attractive
live your
and
life in a
beautiful,
way
like we talked about
so that you
last
can
week
be
with
a
other
witness
people.
to the world around you. And last week in chapter 2, we
So he
saw that he
says you
primarily
need to do
talked
that.
about
Now,
relationships
Paul's addressing
within
both,
the
but I
body of
think
Christ.
given the context,
How
given
are we
the
to live
whole
together
chapter,
within
he's
the body of
primarily
Christ in a
focused
way
here
that makes the gospel
on how
attractive
these
to other
actions are to
people.
be profitable. For
And
those
now when he gets
outside
to
the
chapter 3, he's going to be more
And so
outwardly
we need to
focused. He's
remember
gonna
our
deal
mission.
here
And here's
with
what I'd say
with
our
the
mission
good
is. This
deeds
is
that
the way
we're
we
to
put it
do in
as we
order
began.
for us to
The
be
Christians are to
witness
live in a
to
way
those who are
that
outside
people
the
are
church.
attracted
Things
to
the
the
way that we
gospel
treat
and not
them
repelled by
rather
its
than
followers.
just the way
That's
that we
our
treat each
mission.
other. And so that's
That's
to
what
take
he's
the
gonna deal
gospel to
with
other
here.
people, as I talked
And he
about with the
begins
kids
the
earlier,
chapter with
so
the
that our
command to
actions match
remember.
up with our words, and so
And
that
he's
the
going to
gospel
remind
can be this
Titus
thing that
and the
is
church and
profitable
us
and
of
beautiful
four
for other
important
people.
things that we need to remember.
The second thing he says here is, he says, remember. And I'm going to
how
kind
you
of deal
got
with
here.
these in backwards
Verses
order
4 through
because
7, this is
like
a
last
typical
week, I want to
Paul
begin with the why
set.
and then we'll
Verses
finish
4
with
through
the
7.
what. Because
One
once
long
again, I
sentence,
think we need to understand
like
the
Paul
why
always
before
does.
the what. And
And
so,
it is one of
so
the
he
most
begins in
beautiful
verse 8 and he kind of
pictures
gives us
in
all the
why.
scripture
He
of
says
what
the
our
first thing
salvation
we
is
need to
about.
do is we need to remember
We
the
could
mission.
easily
We
spend
need to
7
remember
weeks
the
on
mission
those
that God
verses
has
right
given
there,
to
those
us. And
4
here's
verses.
what he writes at the end of
Because there are
chapter,
some
or verse 8. He
tremendous
says,
things
these
here
things,
about
he's speaking of
what our
everything he's
salvation
talking
is
about
like.
in verses 1
But
through
the
7.
key
The
thing is
first part
found
of
in verse
8. He
5,
says,
and
all
here's the key
these
thing
things
when he says
that they're
he's
excellent
speaking of
and they're
God,
profitable.
that he saved
And he
us.
says, for the people.
The most important thing about
So my
our
question
salvation
is
is that
who are the people that he's
God is
talking
the
about?
one
Who
who
are the
saved us.
people
The
that-
reason
that
that we
all
got
these
here,
things,
Paul
and we'll
says,
get to them
is
in just a
because of the
moment,
work that
are
God did
profitable
in our
for us.
lives. He says
I
the
think
only
Paul
reason you
left
can
this
even
pretty
do these
ambiguous,
good
and
works
I
that
think he
matter
did it on
is
purpose.
because God came into
I don't think
your
Paul
life
did
and
that
he
by
saved
accident.
you.
He
Completely
wrote-
apart
writes
from
this in a
anything
way
you did to deserve
so that it
that.
can apply
Completely
both to
apart
those who are
from
doing
anything
the
that
good
you did to
works,
earn that.
and it's
God came
profitable
into your
for
life
them
and
because
he
they
saved
get the blessings of being obedient to God and carrying out His mission.
for us to remember as we deal with other
blessing and
people.
being obedient to God.
And here in this
doing what
section,
called
he's
us
going to give us 7
What's
aspects
profitable for them,
of God's
and it's
salvation.
excellent for them, but it's
I put
also
them in there. I don't
excellent
want you
and
to have to
profitable
spend
for
time
those who are
writing them down because
outside
I'm going
the
to go
church.
through these really quickly.
Because
Matter of
when we
fact,
do the kind
most
of good
them I'm
works
just
that
gonna
he's gonna
briefly
talk
mention
about
because
here in
that's
these
all we have
verses,
time
which
to
we'll
do.
get to in a
But
moment,
here it gives us
it
7
becomes a
aspects.
great
Like I say,
witness.
this
It
would be a
makes the
great
gospel
7-week sermon series,
attractive
and maybe
and
someday
beautiful,
that's
like we
what I'm
talked
gonna
about
do.
last week.
But the first thing he talks about is God's goodness there. This idea that God is
So he says,
kind.
you need to do that.
Now,
And
Paul's
tender
addressing both, but I think given the context,
And he
given
talks about
the whole
the
chapter,
the
he's
second
primarily
aspect is
focused
God's
here
loving kindness
on how these actions
It's
are to be
a picture of
profitable for
God's
those outside the
tenderness
church.
towards His people.
And so we need to remember
that
our
He loves
mission.
us
And
so
here's what
much
I'd say
that
our
He's
mission
willing to
is. This is the way we put it as we
intervene in
began.
our lives.
That Christians are to live.
And then
in
it
a
talks
way
about His mercy.
that
God's
people are
mercy
attracted
means
to the gospel
that we
and
don't
not
get the
repelled by its
punishment
followers.
that we
That's
deserve. All of us
our mission.
deserve to be punished for our sin,
take
but
the gospel to
but the
other people, as I
gospel
talked about with the kids
pours out
earlier,
God's
so that
mercy
our
into our
actions
lives.
match up with our words.
And then he
so that
talks
the
about
gospel
regeneration.
can
That's
be
a
this
big
thing
word
that
that just means to be
profitable
born
and
again,
beautiful for other
like
people.
Jesus talked about with Nicodemus in John
The second
chapter
thing he
3.
says here is,
he
he
says
says that he
remember
brings
how
about
you
this
got here.
regeneration by a washing.
Verses
that
4 through
happens in our
7,
life.
this is
And
a
what happens
typical
when Jesus
Paul
Christ comes into our life is
set.
that he
Verses
does a
4 through
washing, he does a
7,
cleansing,
one long
he
set.
wipes out and washes
Like
away
Paul
the
always
sin
does.
that is there so
And
that
it is
God
one
can
of the
come
most
into our lives
beautiful
and save us.
pictures in all the Scripture
He
of what our
says that-
salvation is
that
about.
his salvation
We
is
could
accomplished
we
by
could
the Holy
easily
Spirit
spend
who
7
God
weeks
pours
on
into our
those
life.
verses
The Holy
right
Spirit
there, those
who
4
draws
verses.
us to God, the Holy
Because
Spirit
there
who
are some
convicts us
some
of our sin,
tremendous
the
things
Holy
here
Spirit
about
who comes
what
to
our
dwell
salvation
permanently
is
in our
like.
lives.
But the key thing is found in verse 5, and
here's the key thing when he says that he, speaking of
6,
God,
he says that
he
salvation
saved
comes
us
through his Son, the Lord
The most
Jesus
important
Christ.
thing about
And
our
we know that that's
salvation is
the only way, as we
that
just
God
sang
is the
earlier
one
this
who
morning,
saved us. The
that he
reason
is
that we
the
got
way and
here,
the
Paul
truth
says,
and the life,
is
and that
because
no
of the
one
work
comes to
that
the
God
Father
did in
except
our
through him.
lives. He says
And
the
the
only
last
reason
one
you
should
can
say
even
his
do
grace.
these good
But
works
just
that
notice
matter
that mercy
is
up
because
there
God came into your
talks
life
about
and
his
he
grace,
saved you
the fact that
completely apart
God
from
doesn't
anything you did to
treat us
deserve
as
that,
we
completely
deserve it.
apart
He
from
pours out
anything that you did
blessings
to earn
that
that.
we
God
don't
came
deserve
into your
in our
life
and he saved.
and so he shows all these aspects of
so
God's
important for us
salvation,
to
all these
remember
things
as we
that
deal
God
with other
does for
people.
us. And here in this
And the
section, he's
idea
going to
we've
give us
talked about
7
this before. It's
aspects
so important
of
as we
God's
deal with other
salvation.
people to remember
and
where
I
we
put them
came
in there. I
from,
don't want you
what God
to
has
have to
done
spend
for
time
us.
writing them down because I'm
We
going
need
to
to
go through
remember
these
that
really
the only
quickly.
reason
Matter of
that
fact,
we're here, the
most
only
of them
reason
I'm
we
just
can
gonna
gather
briefly
here like
mention
this and
'cause that's
worship
all we
God,
have time
the
to
only
do.
reason
So here he
that
gives
we
us
can have our
7
sins
aspects. And like I
forgiven,
say, this
the only
would be a
reason we can
great
have a
7-week
relationship
sermon
with God
series.
is
Maybe
because of
someday
what
that's
God
I'm
did
gonna
for
do.
us.
But the first thing he talks about is
We
God's
didn't do
goodness
anything
there,
to
this
earn
idea
that or
that
to
God is
deserve that.
kind. I
And
really like the
tender
way that
towards
that
us.
Pastor Louis Giglio
Then he
talks
talks
about
about
explains
that
this
the
whole
second
idea.
aspect is God's loving kindness there. It's a picture
Go
of
ahead.
God's tenderness
When we come to
towards
know
his
God,
people,
God
that He
dispenses
loves us
grace
so
and
much
mercy
that
with a
He's willing
shovel.
to intervene in our
Do you know what I'm
lives.
talking about?
And then it talks
You
about
need
His
grace?
mercy.
I
God's
mean, we got a
mercy
shovel
means
way bigger
that
than
we
this one, the
don't
biggest one
get
we
the
could get.
punishment
And I mean,
that we
it's a
deserve. All of us
shovel
deserve
full
to
of
be
grace
punished for our sin,
on your
but,
life.
but the gospel.
You need more today? Well, my
pours out
mercies are
God's
new every single
mercy
day. So when
into
you
our
wake up,
lives.
just imagine tomorrow. that
Then he
there's an
talks
angel
about
standing by the bed,
regeneration.
and
That's a
he's
big
just
word that
shoveling
just
mercy
means to be
and pouring
born
it on
again,
you
like
before you even hit the
Jesus
snooze
talked
button
about with
tomorrow. I'm assuming you're gonna
Nicodemus
hit the
in
snooze
John
button,
chapter
and he's
3.
just saying mercy on
And he
your
says
life.
that he
This isn't
brings about
yesterday's
this
mercy. This is
regeneration
new
by a
mercy today.
washing
I got a shovel. We
that
got
happens
lots
in
of
our
angels
life.
and lots of
And what
shovels,
happens when
and it's like
Jesus
mercy
Christ
on
comes
your
into our
today,
life is that
mercy
he
on your
does a
big
washing, he
shovel of
does a
mercy on your
cleansing,
life. Do you-
he
have you
wipes
messed
out
up
and
a lot?
washes
I
away
got
the
grace. I
sin
got
that
a
is there
big
so that God
mountain
can come into
called
our
Calvary
lives.
back here, and I'm just going to start down here, and I'm just going to put
He
grace
says
on your
that,
life, and I'm
that
using a big
his
shovel of
salvation is
forgiveness,
accomplished
and I'm
by
putting
the
a big
Holy Spirit who
shovel
God
of my
pours into
kindness,
our life,
and I'm
the
putting
Holy
a big
Spirit who
shovel
draws
of
us
my
to God, the Holy
righteousness.
Spirit
And
who
I mean,
convicts us
we
of our
just getting
sin, the Holy Spirit who
shovelfuls
comes
of
to
the grace
dwell
and mercy of God.
permanently
Some
in
of
our
you come to
lives
Passion City
that
Church
very moment
because
that
you
we put our
know
faith
we
in
use a
Jesus
shovel
Christ.
at Passion City Church, and you're like, man, I need
60
to know
says
that I'm
that
under
salvation
grace.
comes
I need
through
to know
his
that God
Son,
still
the
loves me.
Lord
I need to
Jesus
know that
Christ.
power
And we
of
know that that's
salvation in
the
my
only
life.
way,
You
as we
show
just
up
sang
week
earlier
after
this
week
morning,
because you know
that
the
he is
cross
the
is
way
gonna be
and the
lifted
truth
up,
and the
and
life,
grace
and
is
that
gonna
no
be
one
on
comes to
display.
the Father except through him.
And we say, thank
And
you,
the last
God,
one should say his grace.
you have
I just
so
noticed I put
loved
mercy up there twice.
us.
Talks about his grace, the fact that God doesn't treat us as we deserve,
And then
that
we go,
he pours out
people in our
blessings
lives.
that we don't deserve in our
I
lives.
say,
And so he shows all these aspects of God's salvation, all these things that God
"Oh, I
does
need some
for us.
grace."
And the idea, we've talked about this before, it's so important as we're dealing
need
with
some
other
mercy?
people to remember
Oh,
where we
man,
came
I'm
from and
full
what
of
God
mercy.
has done for us. We need to remember that the only reason that we're here, the only reason we can gather here like this and worship God, the only reason that we can have our sins forgiven, the only reason we can have a relationship with God is because of what God did for us.
And
We didn't do anything to earn that or to deserve that. I really like the way that Pastor Louis Giglio kind of explains
When
this
we
whole
come to know
idea.
God,
It's
God
because we're
dispenses.
flawed in our thinking.
Go
We
ahead.
have a tendency
When we come to know God, God
expect more from
dispenses
and
grace
treat
and
others
mercy with a
than
shovel.
what we want God.
Do you know what I'm talking about?
Yes.
You need grace? I mean, we're getting a shovel
God.
way bigger than this one, the biggest one we could get. And I mean, it's a shovel full
So
of
many
grace
times, isn't it,
on your life.
to the world around us.
You need more today? Well, my mercies are new every single day. So when you wake up, just imagine tomorrow that there's an
You know
angel
why
standing
it
by the
is?
bed, and he's just shoveling mercy and pouring it on you before you even hit the snooze button tomorrow. I'm assuming you're
When
going to
we
hit the
get
snooze
the
button,
shovel,
and he's just
we're
saying
more
mercy
prone
on
to
your
get
life. This is not yesterday's mercy. This is new mercy
It
today.
means
I got a shovel. We got
that
lots
we
of
really
angels and lots of shovels,
have
and
not
it's like
ever
mercy on your life today, mercy on your life. Big shovel of mercy on your life. Have you messed up a lot in life? I got grace. I got a big mountain called Calvary back here, and I'm just going to start down here, and I'm just going to put grace on your life.
need to
And I'm using
remember.
a big shovel of forgiveness, and I'm putting a big
Third thing is
shovel
we need
of
to
my
remember
kindness, and I'm
who
putting
we
a big
were.
shovel of my righteousness.
We need
And
to
I
think
mean,
back. He
we just
says,
getting
for you,
shovelfuls
for
of
we
the grace and
ourselves
mercy of
were,
God.
and then he
Some of
gives
you
this
come to
whole
Passion
long
City Church
list
because you
of what
know
these
we use a
people were
shovel
like
at
before
Passion City
Jesus
Church, and
Christ
you're like,
came
man, I need to know
into
that
their
I'm
lives,
under
and
grace.
he
I
did
need to
this
know that God
saving
still
work
loves me.
that
I
we
need to
just
know
looked
that
at.
power of salvation in my life. And you show up here week after week because you know the cross is going to be lifted up and grace is going to be on display.
This is what Paul writes
And we
to
say,
us
"Thank
as
you,
well. We
God."
need to remember
You
what we were
so
like
love
before Jesus Christ came into our lives.
Shovel.
And once again, there's another list of 7 things here. It's interesting.
And then we
He
go
begins with these 7
to our
aspects
lives.
of, we saw just a moment of God's salvation. Now he's going to talk about
need
these,
some grace?
these 7 vices that were present in all of our lives before we
Oh, I
came
need
to
some
know
grace.
Jesus Christ. This is what you were like, he says. And so he comes along and he
Need some
gives us
mercy?
this list of
Man,
seven
I'm full of mercy.
vices that characterize who we once were. He says, first of all, he says that
You
we
know
were
kindness?
foolish.
I got
It
kindness.
means that we were without knowledge here, that we didn't have any
We
knowledge.
celebrate the show.
And sometimes we expect Christians to live, or non-Christians to live like Christians, and the fact is they just don't know how to do that. Second, he says that we were disobedient. We're these rebellious creatures that just, that's our nature, is that we want to disobey God. He says we were led astray. It's a really interesting word that he uses there. It's where we get our word planet from, which a planet just means a wandering star, because they appear to wander in the sky since they don't stay in the same place in relationship to the other stars. And that's what he says. We were all just kind of like wandering around, being led astray all over the place because we didn't have any direction in our life. He said we were sins, or we were slaves to passions and pleasures because we didn't have anything else. That's how we guide our lives. We were all like that at one time. He says that we're passing our days in malice and envy, and that's our natural position as human beings, isn't it? We see someone else has something, and we want it, and we get mad at them, and we treat them with malice. We need to remember that we're hated by others, and finally that we're hating one another, and that's really the end thing that happens when we live in this world and we live according to our human nature, for we ourselves were. And then he gives us the way all of you were, of what these people were like. Paul writes about this a lot, doesn't he? In the book of Ephesians, he puts it this way. He said that you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live. He says that you were separated from Christ, without hope and without God in the world. We need to keep in mind that that's who all of us were. We were all that person until once again there's another list of seven things here. It's interesting. He begins with these seven aspects of we saw just a moment of God's salvation. Now he's going to talk about these, get on our high horse, before we begin to condemn all of our lives, people around us, before we get so angry and mad at the world around us, maybe we ought to sometimes, along, he gives us this list remember of seven, that we were just like those people at one time, and that without the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ, that's who we would still be. Means that we were, and that we need to pour out grace and mercy, not with the little teaspoonfuls. We didn't have any knowledge into the lives of others. And sometimes we expect Christians to live, or non-Christians to live like Christians. Until now, we primarily dealt with the why. Why should we live in a way that he says that we were disobedient? Why should we live in a way that we don't repel people away from the gospel? And the reason is because of what God has done for us. He says we were led astray. It's a really interesting word that he uses there. It's where we get our word planet from. Which a planet just means we're going to come out star really to wander in the sky. What are we to do in light of that? We're going to answer really the question that we asked earlier. How are all just kind of like wandering around, live in a way, being led astray all over the place because we didn't push people away from the gospel. He said we were sins. So this is really, I think, the application pleasures part of it. Because we didn't have anything else. That's how we guide our lives. We were all like that at one time. He says that we're passing our days in malice and envy, and that's our natural position as human beings, isn't it? We see someone else has something, and think about how well am I doing, and we get mad at them, and am I really being a good witness for Jesus Christ? It says that we're hated by others, and finally that we're hating one another, and that's really the end thing that happens when we live in this world and we live according to our human nature, our Holy Spirit brings something to mind. He says that's the way all of you were. That's an area I could work on. Maybe just circle that. Paul writes about this sermon outline home with you this week. I mean, in the book of Ephesians, he puts it this way. He said that you were dead in your transgressions and sins in which you used to live. Who can hold you? He says that you were separated from what I want to do before we, without hope, without God in the world. And we need to keep in mind that that's who all of us were. We were all that person until Jesus Christ came into our lives. That our human spirits would be open to that salvation as you speak to us. So before we get on our high horse, before we begin to condemn people around us, before we get so angry and mad at the world around us, maybe we ought to sometimes remember that we were just like those people at one time, and that without the grace and mercy of Jesus Christ, that's some sin that we need to confess to you, Father. And that we need to pour out grace and mercy, not with the little teaspoonfuls, but with shovelfuls into the
last
lives
thing
of
he
others,
says,
because
you
that's
need
what
to
we
remember
receive.
how to act. And then he's going to give us this list. Guess what?
So up
7
till now,
again.
we primarily
Another
dealt
list
with
of
the
7.
why.
What a surprise.
Why should we
And
live
I'm
in
going
a
to spend
way
a little
that we
bit
make
more
the
time on these, although
gospel
again,
attractive?
this could
Why
be
should
7
we
more
live in a
sermons
way
easily,
that we don't
because I think
repel
these are really
people
the-
away from the
here's where
gospel? And the reason
where the
is
rubber meets
because
the
of
road,
what
so to
God
speak.
has
So
done for
7
us, and the reason
seven
is because of
virtues
that we
of
want to have
who we
present
once
in our
were.
life. The first one he says
So
is
we're
that
gonna
we're gonna come
submit
now
to
to really
rulers
to the
and
what.
authorities.
What are we to do in light of that? We're going to
This
answer
is
the
one,
really
frankly,
the
where I
question
think a
that,
lot of
that we
Christians
that we asked
even missed
earlier.
the
How
boat.
do
I'm
you?
gonna- I'll probably
How
spend more
do
time
we
on this one than
live in a
than
way that
most
we
of the
don't do
others,
that?
because I think it's
That we
it's
don't
so
push people
important.
away from the gospel.
I mean, I think about.
So this is
Think
really,
about
I
the
think, the
time
application
that
part of it.
Jesus
And
lived in.
here's
Think
what I
about
want
the
to do
time that
before I
Paul
go
lived
through
in.
this list.
Sometimes
Sometimes
we
we think
things here
we
that
have it
relate
just
that.
so bad here in the United States
wanna
that,
encourage
that
you
we're
as we go through
justified
this
in not
list of
submitting
7
to the
things to
rulers and authorities.
think
We
about
think,
your own
oh,
life.
I only have to do that when they
To
do something
evaluate
that
your
I
own
like.
life.
To think about how well am I doing these things in my life? Am I
Jesus,
really
think about
being a
this.
good witness for
Jesus
Jesus
told
Christ?
his disciples,
Our mi-
"Go
go
ahead
ahead
and
and
pay
pay your taxes." And you know what?
Consistent with
Jesus
my
knew what
word.
those taxes were being used for. And I'll guarantee you there were some things that the taxes were being used
as
for.
maybe something
that
comes to
that were
mind as
not
the Holy Spirit
consistent
brings
with the
something to
teaching of
mind.
the
If you'd
Bible.
If you'd have to say, you know, that's an area I
Matter of
can
fact,
maybe
some of
just
those
circle
taxes
that.
were being
Take your
used
sermon
to
outline
fund a
home with
military
you
who
this
was
week
going
and
to
pray
oppose
about that and
Jesus
ask
and
God
who
to
would,
help you.
who would
Maybe
persecute
find
his
someone else,
followers
another
after
mature
him.
Christian who can
And
help
yet
you work
Jesus
on that
still
area in your
says,
life,
no,
who
go
can
ahead
hold
and
you
pay your
accountable.
taxes. Or
So
think
what I
about
wanna do
Paul. I mean,
before
Paul
we-
writes about it
before
here,
we get to
but
this
there's some
next
other
list,
places
I
where
wanna
Paul
pause for a
writes
moment
even
and
more about
pray.
this
Just
idea of
ask God
submitting
to
to
work
rulers
in
and
all of our
authorities.
lives as we go
Think
through
about
this.
Romans
So
chapter
you pray with me.
13. He
Father,
says
I
not
do
only are you
ask
to
right
submit
now
to them, he says you're to
that our
honor
human
them and to
spirits would be
respect
open to your
them.
Holy Spirit as you speak to us.
He doesn't say just honor and respect them if
Help
you
us to
like them,
listen.
if
Help
you
us
agree
to
with them, if
hear
they're
your
of the
voice
same
as we
political
obey.
party you are. He says,
Father,
that
as we
you're to
think
honor
about
and
our own
respect
lives, we
those that
think
God
about
has put in power.
how
And
you
you know
want
what
us
he
to
says?
live
He
for
says
you.
if
You
you
just-
do that, if you resist
you
them,
just make it
you're
really
actually
clear
resisting
to each
Jesus
one of our
himself
lives
because
that
he
there's
put
something
them
that we
there.
need to change, something that we need to do differently, some sin that we need to confess to you.
First Timothy chapter
Thank
2,
you
he
for
tells us
doing
to
that.
pray for our leaders. He doesn't just say pray for the leaders you like.
So the last
He
thing
says
he
pray
says
for
you
all
need
your
to remember
leaders.
how
That's
to-
part of what we're called
And then he's
to
going to
do
give us
as
this list.
followers
Guess
of
what?
Jesus
7
Christ.
again. Another list of 7. What a surprise.
And I'm going to spend a little bit more time on
This
these
is an
all
area
again.
where we
This
need to
could
be
be really
really
careful.
careful.
If we're going to live in a way
because I
that
think
makes
these are
the
really
gospel
here's where
attractive to those
where the
who
rubber
are
meets the
outside the
road, so to
church.
speak. So 7
and not
seven
push them away, not
virtues
repel them,
that we
and
want to have
to be
present
really,
in our
really
life. The first
careful
one
with
he
this.
says is that we're to submit to rulers and authorities.
Now, there's nothing wrong with being good citizens.
And
As
this
a
is
matter
one,
of fact,
frankly,
the
where I
Bible
think a
tells
lot
us
of
we
Christians
ought
have
to
kind of missed
we
the
ought to
boat. So
vote.
I'll
We
probably
ought to
spend
try
more
to
time
vote
on
for
this
godly
one
people and
than-
get
than
them
most
into
of the
office.
others, 'cause I
We ought to
think it's-
support
it's so
legislation
important
that's working towards. I mean,
towards
I think
godly
think
means.
about the
But
this
time
this whole
that
idea of
Jesus lived in.
of
Think
trying
about the
to
time that Paul lived in.
Sometimes
To
we
make
think
our
we have it just
society
so
into
bad here
what
in
we
the
think
United
it ought to
States
be
that,
through the
that we're
political process is
justified in not
something we just
submitting to
don't
the
find
rulers and
in the
authorities. That we think,
Scriptures.
oh, I only have to do that when they do something that I like.
I would say
But
this. we
Jesus,
gotta be
think
really
about this.
careful because
Jesus told his
every time
disciples,
that
go
we
ahead and
allow
pay your taxes.
politics to
And you
mix-
know what?
mix
Jesus
with
knew
our
what those taxes
Christianity,
were being
we
used
run
for.
the risk
And I'll
of
guarantee you there were some
basically
things that the
alienating half the
taxes were
people
being
in this
used
world.
for that
let's
were
face
not
it, here in this
consistent with
country,
the
we're
teaching of the
pretty
Bible.
much split half and half.
Matter of
And if
fact,
we're gonna
some of
make
those
our
taxes were
politics
being
more
used
important than our
to
loyalty
fund a
to
military
Jesus
who
Christ,
was going to
we
oppose
run the
Jesus
risk
and
that
who
we're
would,
gonna-
who would
we're gonna
persecute his
immediately make the
followers
gospel
after him.
unattractive to
And
about
yet
half the
Jesus
people
still
in this
says, no, go ahead and pay your taxes.
we need to
Or
be
think
careful.
about Paul. I mean, Paul
There's no
writes about it
excuse
here,
for a Christian
but there's some
ever
other
calling
places
any
where Paul writes
politician, no
even
matter
more
what we
about
might
this
think
idea of
about that
submitting to
person,
rulers and
calling them
authorities.
derogatory
Think about about Romans chapter 13. He says not
this
only
age
are
of-
you to submit
of
to them,
social
he
media,
says you're to honor
we
them and to
shouldn't
respect
be
them.
posting Photoshopped photos.
He
of
doesn't
people
say
that make
just
them
honor
look
and respect
bad.
them if you like them, if
We
you
shouldn't be
agree with them,
publishing
if they're of the
information
same
that we
political
know
party you are. He
is
says
not true.
that you're to honor and
Or
respect those
information
that
that
God
we
has
haven't
put in
checked
power.
out.
And you know
We
what
need
he
to be
says? He
really
says if
careful
you
in
do
this
that,
area,
if you
because
resist them,
we could
you're
just
actually
run so many
resisting
people off.
Jesus
We
himself
first of all,
because he
you're
put
to
them there.
submit to rulers and authorities.
Second thing says is that you're to be obedient.
1 Timothy.
I think he's still relating
Chapter
this
2,
back
he tells
to the
us to
idea of
pray
the
for our leaders. He
submission
doesn't
to
just
the
say
rulers
pray
and
for the
authorities.
leaders
And what
you
we find
like.
in the Scripture,
He says
there's
pray for all
really
your
only a
leaders.
very
That's
narrow
part of
what we're
exception
called to
when we're
do
not to
as
obey our
followers of
government leaders.
Jesus Christ.
And frankly, to be real honest, here in the United States, it doesn't happen very often.
I think this
He
is
says the only
where we
time
need
that
to
you're
be
not
really
to obey
careful.
the
If we're going to
government
live in a
leaders is
way
when they
that makes
when
the
they
gospel
tell
attractive
you
to
you
those
have to do something
who are
that
outside the
Scriptures
church,
prohibit, or when
and
they
not
keep you
push
from
them
doing
away,
something
not
that
repel
Scriptures
them,
tell you you're supposed
we
to
have
do.
to be really, really
Great
careful
example
in
is the
this
book of Daniel. We see both those things there, don't we?
Now,
We
there's
see
nothing
this
wrong with being good
Nebuchadnezzar
citizens.
makes
As
this
a
big
matter of
golden
fact,
image,
the
and he
Bible
tells
tells
everyone,
us
you
we
have to
we
bow
ought
down to it.
we
And
ought to
Daniel
vote.
and his friends say, no,
We ought to
we're
try
not
to
going to
vote
do that
for
because
godly
we're going to obey
people and
God
get them
rather
into
than
office.
We ought to support
And then
legislation
later on,
that's working
they
towards
make
a law that
towards
says you
godly
can't go out and
needs.
pray anymore. And what does Daniel do? He says, well,
But
God
this-
told me
this
to pray, so
whole
I'm going to
idea
go
of-
pray.
of trying
We see
to
something similar in the New Testament,
to
don't we?
make our
When
society
Peter and,
into what we
and the
think
other
it ought to be
apostles,
through
they're out there
political
preaching the
process is
gospel,
something
and the
we just
authorities
don't
tell them,
find
don't you
in
preach the gospel anymore. And they say, we have to obey God rather than men. But what's interesting in both situations is there's some serious
this, we gotta be
consequences
really careful
that go
because
along with disobeying
every
the
time
government.
that
And we
allow
need to be willing to do
politics
that
to
if those
mix
situations come
with our
along. We need to
Christianity,
recognize
we run the risk
God never
of
promised
basically
it's gonna make it easy
alienating
for
half
us.
the people in this world.
But that's really
And
the
let's
only
face it,
exception
here in this
that we
country,
have.
we're
Pretty
in the
much split
Scripture.
half and half. The third thing
And
here
if
he
we're gonna
says
make our
that we need to be
politics more
ready
important
for
than our
every
loyalty
good
to
work.
Jesus Christ,
I would
we
just say
run the
this
risk
means
that
being
we're gonna
like
immediately
eager to do
make
good
the
work.
gospel unattractive.
It
to
means
about
that
half the
I don't
people
just
in this country.
begrudgingly go around and do nice things
Please
for
be
other
careful.
people. It means I'm
There's
eager
no
to do
excuse
good.
for a Christian
Even to
ever
someone who
calling
wrongs
any
me, even
politician,
to
no
someone
matter
who
what we might
disagrees
think
with
about
me,
that person,
even
calling
someone who
them
belongs to a
derogatory
different
names.
political party or someone who voted for a different
In
candidate.
this age of
I'm willing to do
social
social
media,
just in the name of
we
Jesus
shouldn't be,
Christ.
we
And I'm
shouldn't be
eager
posting
and anxious to do
Photoshop
that.
photos.
He says we're to
people that make
speak
them
evil
look
of no
bad.
one. The word there is literally
shouldn't
the
be
word
publishing
blaspheme. We're not
information
to
that we
do
know
anything that would
is not
blaspheme
true. Someone else
or
there.
information that we haven't checked out. I mean,
We
we
need to be really
should
careful in this
confront
area because
sin in other
we
people.
could just run so
We
many
should
people off
bring
places.
people
First of
to
all,
repent.
you're to
That's not
submit
what I'm
to
talking
rulers and
about.
authorities.
Second, thing says,
But we
is
shouldn't
that you're
speak
contemptuously of
obedient.
people. We shouldn't,
I
as
think
I
he's
said
still
before,
relating the
expect
fact
the
that idea of the
non-Christians are
submission
submission
to
to the
Christians.
rulers
They
and
don't know
authorities. And
how.
what we find in the Scripture
And so
is
for us to
there's
sit there and
really
make fun
only
of
a
them
very
or to
narrow
speak
exception when we're not
contemptuously
to
of them
obey our
is
government
not
leaders.
going to help the cause.
And
of
frankly, to be real honest, here in
Says
the United
fifth,
States,
you need
to
to avoid
avoid
quarreling.
quarreling. I
I
mean, sometimes
He says the only
conflict is
time that you're
inevitable.
not to
But
obey
what
the
he's
government
saying here
leaders
is
is
that
when
we
they
should be
the ones to start
when
the
they
fight.
tell you
I mean,
you
there are
have to do
times,
something
obviously,
that
to stand up
Scriptures
for the gospel,
prohibit,
but for
or
the
when they
most part,
keep
we
you
ought
from
to
doing
avoid that
something
when
that
we can.
Scriptures tell you you're
He
supposed
says
to do.
we ought to treat them with
Great
gentleness.
example is the book of Daniel.
idea
We see
here is
both
that
those
we need
things
to be
there, don't we?
patient again with
We
sin.
see this Nebuchadnezzar
Recognizing
makes
that we
this
were
big
just
golden
like
image,
them
and he tells everyone,
at
"You're
one
gonna,
time.
you have to
And
bow
finally he
down to
says
it." And
that we need
Daniel
to
and his
show
friends say,
perfect
"No, we're not going to
courtesy
do that because we're going to
toward
obey God rather than really
men."
interesting word there." And then
It's word
later on,
translated
they
meat
make a law that
almost
says you
everywhere
can't
else
go out and pray
in the
anymore. And what does
Scriptures.
Daniel
The
do? He
word
says, "Well,
means
God told me
power
to pray, so I'm
and
going to go pray."
And
We
it's
see
that idea
something
that we've
similar in
talked
the New
about before,
Testament,
that I
don't
need to
we?
be willing to
When
yield
Peter
my
and
rights
and the other apostles,
the
they're
gospel,
out there preaching the gospel, and the authorities tell them, "Don't you preach the gospel anymore." And
Christians
they
are to
say, "We
live in
have
a
to
way
obey God rather than men."
that people
But what's
are
interesting in
attracted to
both
the gospel
situations
and
is
not
there's
repelled
some
by its
serious
followers.
consequences that go
As we
along
close
with
this morning, I
disobeying
want
the
to share
government.
with
And
you
they
the
were,
words
we
of
need to be
David
willing to
Rambo.
do
He
that.
was
If
the
those
former
situations
president
come
of the
along, we need to recognize
Christianary Mission Alliance.
God never promised it's
And
going to
here's-
make it easy for us.
Here's what he said.
But that's really
He
the
said,
only
"By our
exception
action that we
activism,
have
often
in the
poorly conceived and stridently
The
promoted.
third thing here he
we
says
have
that we need
created
to
an
be
image of
ready for
rigid,
every good
prejudiced
work.
people. I would just say this
More and
means
more
being
Americans will feel entirely
eager to do
justified
good
and
works. It
respectful
means
of
that I
saying
don't
no
just
to the
begrudgingly go around
They may not
and
be
do
rejecting
nice things
Jesus,
for other
just
people.
the
It means
because
who
I'm eager
profess
to
to
do
follow
good.
him.
Even to someone who wrongs
This
me,
is
even
not
to
to
someone
say
who
we should pull
disagrees
back
with me,
into isolation
even
and
someone who
mentality
belongs to a different
and do
political
nothing
party,
more
or
to
someone who
preserve
voted
as
for a
many
different
Christian
candidate,
values
that
as
I'm willing to
possible
do
within
good
our
to them
society.
just in the name
God
of Jesus
expects us
Christ,
to
and
be
I'm
salt
eager and
in
anxious
the
to
world.
do that. He says we're to
Here's
speak
really the
evil of
meat,
no
and here's what I
one.
want you to take.
The word there is literally the word
Let's do it in
blaspheme.
the
We're not
context of
to
God's
do anything that
redeeming
would
love for all
blaspheme
men and women.
someone else.
We must focus on the gospel, proclaim it
I mean,
winsomely
we
to secular
should
people,
confront
rather
sin
than
and other-
alienating them
we
on
should
matters
bring people
that are
to
not
repent.
central. to
That's
our
not what I'm
message.
talking
That's
about
not
here. But we shouldn't speak contemptuously of people. We shouldn't, as I said before, expect that non-Christians are going to act like Christians. They don't know how. And so for us to sit there and make fun of them or to speak contemptuously of them is not going to help the cause of the gospel. It says, fifth, you need to avoid quarreling. I mean, sometimes conflict is inevitable, but what he's saying here is that we shouldn't be the ones to start the fight. I mean, there are times, obviously, to stand up for the gospel, but for the most part, we ought to avoid that when we can. He says we ought to treat them with gentleness. The idea here is that we need to be patient, again, with sinners, recognizing that we were just like them at one time. And finally, he says that we need to show perfect courtesy toward all people. It's a really interesting word there. It's a word that's translated meek almost everywhere else in the Scriptures. A word that means power under control. And it's that idea that we've talked about before, that I need to be willing to yield my rights for the good of the gospel and for the furtherance of the gospel. Christians are to live in a way that people are attracted to the gospel and not repelled by its followers. As we close this morning, I want to share with you the words of David Rambo. He was the former president of the Christianity and Mission Alliance. And here's what he said. He said, by our activism, often poorly conceived and stridently promoted, we have created an image of rigid, prejudiced people. More and more Americans will feel entirely justified and respectable saying no to the church. They may not be rejecting Jesus, just the people who profess to follow him. This is not to say that we should pull back into isolationist mentality and do nothing more to preserve as many Christian values as possible within our society. God expects us to be salt in the world. But here's really the meat, and here's what I want you to take away. But let's do it in the context of God's redeeming love for all men and women. We must focus on the gospel, proclaim it winsomely to secular people, rather than alienating them on matters that are not central to our message. Let's pray.